Hi, and welcome back to the Mind of the Writer. So I wanted to look at two things today, or I think we could call it three things. I wanted to look at something that I'm going to call a metaphorical triad. So that's looking at three things all related and all being compared to one another without using the word like or as. Usually we think of metaphors as two things being compared. And then I wanted to look at personifying nature, but then nature-ifying people in poetry. And as I have done in the last two videos, think about how this method or this strategy or these ideas can influence the way that we interact with ourselves, environment, and others, perhaps a sense of spirit off page. So again, I want you to think of the poem as something fairly sacred, a hymn or a prayer, has a sense of divinity about it, however you view the divine to be, because I know that that's going to vary from person to person. So a metaphorical triad, to repeat often, most of the time, all of the time, we think of a metaphor with two components to it. And you're comparing one thing to the other without using the word like or as. So, for example, if I refer to a raindrop as a tear, that is a metaphor. I'm not saying a raindrop is like a tear. I'm just saying a tear of rain. In that way, that is a metaphor. But I found myself lately bringing a third element into my metaphorical comparisons. And I did this fairly recently in a poem on LinkedIn, where I had this comparison between a drop of ink, a drop of rain, and a tear. So in the usual dynamic of a metaphor, I think of a coin with two sides. But in this, I'm thinking of a triangle. So you have this triangle of three things, all of equal importance, all that are being compared to one another, and all giving meaning to the other. So if you think of a teardrop as a drop of ink, the emotion going into the page, but also as a drop of rain, something that's coming from the sky and something that's feeding a leaf, you have this very interesting dance of images happening. If I just compare a tear to a drop of ink, and I leave the raindrop out of it, then that leaves that other element of something coming from the sky, something feeding a leaf, or a dead or a bulb so that it can grow. That then comes out of the equation. And I think that by bringing that third thing in, it's just adding something to the poem. This isn't something that I've seen done a lot, but just like with making words up and creating words, that doesn't mean that as a writer that you can't do that. I think that it's your job as a writer to jump outside of the accepted norms and start to experiment even with literary devices like similes and metaphors. With personification and what I'm going to call naturification, I don't want to call it naturalization because that word exists and it means something completely different. Same idea. Personification is something that exists already. It's a very well-known thing, and this is where you take human attributes and you put them onto inanimate objects. I believe you can also put them onto nature as well to sort of bring those things to life. And I think that this is such a key thing to do, because you can, if you start to personify and animate objects, you highlight the miracle of those objects. So taking a line from a poem or a couple of lines from a poem I wrote a couple of weeks ago, I could say, there's a candle on the table. The candle just is on the table and it, it's glowing. Or I could say, that the candle light danced in yellow on the table. All of a sudden, you've got the personification in there and you have the idea of light dancing, and it brings that light to life and it gives it a miraculous quality that if I just say, well, the candle was glowing, you don't feel that miraculous quality. I think that the same can be done the opposite way around. So a poem that I also wrote recently, I did this. I took words that apply to nature and I applied them to lovers. So talking about the shoreline of the body, or the glances like snow, or the breath like wind, the breath like a gale. And so what that does is it brings this natural, elemental, instinctual force into the lovers, and you realize that humans also contain nature within them. And I'm really highlighting that nature. So this is another thing that I think that you can do with your writing to bring some life into it, really give it an adrenaline shot. And maybe what you're doing is you're not so much giving it an adrenaline shot, but you're actually highlighting what's already there. In other words, humans already have that very elemental, instinctual nature. And so by using the nature words, whether it's the shoreline or the rough waves or whatever you're taking and applying it to lovers, for example, you're really just highlighting what's already there, and you're drawing your reader's attention to it. And the same when you personify something else, it's already there. The light is already dancing. It is a miracle. It is a wonder of the world in a way. But by personifying it, you're drawing the reader's attention to it. This is going to be a fairly short video, but my last point is, how does this practice of doing this in writing shape the way that we look at the world and our experiences off page? And I would say, once again, it really brings a sense of wonder and a sense of the miraculous to what we take for granted as fairly mundane and ordinary. And so by treating the poem with reverence, when we're out in the world, we also learn to apply that same skill to the things that are around us all the time. And again, once you start to do that, you realize that there is true poetry in off-page interactions and in off-page things that are happening all around us. So a very short video this week, but I wanted you to think about personification, naturification, and then looking at a metaphorical triad and perhaps trying that in your poetry or in your writing, as opposed to just the run-of-the-mill metaphor, the two sides of the coin. So we'll see you next week on The Mind of the Writer. Thank you.